Well, good evening, everybody. We still have a minute or so to get going, so we're just going to give some time for folks to join. I was telling our speaker this evening, Ellen, no pressure, but we have about 132 people registered for this talk, and that is the largest registration we've ever had since we started the speaker series last year. So telling Ellen no pressure, but that is exciting that so many people have made time to learn about the important work in history that she's going to be sharing with us today. And just looking at the guest list too, it's nice to see some familiar names. I'm welcoming folks back. We had a great start last year for the park's 10th anniversary and started this speaker series that has been sponsored by our parks friends group, Pacific Historic Parks. So we're very grateful for them to sponsor this speaker series. So it's very exciting. Well, I'd love to, we're maybe give another minute or so for people to join. Would love to hear if people are willing to put in the chat where folks are joining us from this evening. I know there's somebody already joining from Seattle. I know it's very late for you. Thank you. Honolulu. Oh, Korea. Yes, this camp is in your neighborhood, Vicky. Vancouver. Excellent. Kailua. Oh, that's great. Kaneohe. Oh, Portland, Oregon, Joel. That's where I returned back home from. I was living in Portland, Oregon before I started this position. Yeah, I agree, Liz. So many people. Well, Ili, Mimi, that's actually where I was born and raised and grew up. So, yeah, my hood. It's great. Well, thanks, everybody. I really appreciate everybody joining tonight, and I think I share your excitement and why you've registered. It's funny because Ellen and I first met. She actually did not share this in her biography that's on our website, but I met her because she's also a very talented textile artist. As part of our 10th anniversary, our finale event was a community-driven art exhibit at the Downtown Art Center, and she had submitted 2 pieces, which our curator selected immediately. And it was this beautiful quilt that she had. And then we got to talking, and I learned more about her and her experience and her background. And I thought, oh my gosh, she would make a great speaker. So I was grateful when she said yes, she'd be delighted to join our speaker series. So tonight is officially a kickoff for our 80th commemorative events for Honolulu National Historic Site. It was the largest and longest used incarceration site in the Hawaiian Islands during World War II. And this year marks 80 years since the camp was closed. So starting this month with Ellen's talk, we are commemorating this 80 years all the way through September with various events, musical performances, speaker series. We're actually making our way to the neighbor islands this year, which I'm excited about because there are incarceration sites across the neighbor islands and the Hawaiian Islands when this happened. And there were sites and people from other islands that were also held at Honolulu. So I'm excited to be able to do some of the documentary film screenings we did last year on the neighbor islands, along with a panel session. We're also partnering with our public libraries to do pop-up exhibits on those islands as well, in conjunction with the film screening. So we have a lot of great opportunities for people to engage and continue to learn about this important work. So without further ado, I want to share with folks a little bit more about Ellen before she starts her presentation. As I said, Ellen is a beautiful textile artist, but really that's not what you're here to hear from her about. Maybe in a later talk in the future, Ellen, you can share some of your beautiful quilts. But in the 1980s, Ellen Godbey Carson represented the Japanese Americans in a class action lawsuit that went to the United States Supreme Court, seeking redress for the massive deprivations of constitutional rights of these Americans during World War II. She's spoken throughout the country about these injustices and the importance of protecting constitutional rights. Ellen has been a leader in the Hawaii legal community, serving as president of the Hawaii State Bar Association, Hawaii Women Lawyers, the Institute of Human Services, and other community organizations. She's received numerous awards, including being the recipient of one of the American Bar Association's highest awards, the Margaret Brent Award for Women Lawyers of Achievement, awarded to only 5 lawyers in the nation each year. Now in retirement, she enjoys doing community advocacy and participating in local cultural activities, including bone dancing, which the season has already kicked off. So with that, I will hand it over to Ellen.
Thank you so much, Christine, and the National Park Service and the Pacific Historic Parks for hosting this program. I thank each of you who are attending and spending some time today for your interest and for being here to talk about this important topic. Some of you I know already have extensive history in regards to the Japanese Americans, and others are new to this topic. I hope you all will learn something new today in regards to this very important history for our country. Let's see, I've got some slides to show you, some photos, and I want to be able to go ahead and put those on the screen so you won't need to be looking at me the whole time. And let's see, let me get my screen shared. Soon after the beginning of the Second World War, President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. You may have heard of that order. That order is the one that, in conjunction with related military orders, authorized the military to force Japanese Americans out of their homes on the West Coast and incarcerate them in detention camps. Congress backed up that executive order with criminal penalties, and the courts enforced the military's orders. The government's actions resulted in the incarceration of over 120,000 Americans of Japanese ancestry. 2/3 of them were U.S. citizens. This photo is of Manzanar, California, which was one of the largest detention facilities. Japanese Americans were held in dozens of facilities like these, surrounded like barbed wire, sentry towers, and armed guards, often for the duration of the war. This mass exclusion and incarceration were based solely on Japanese ancestry and occurred without any proof of wrongdoing or individual hearings. No similar actions were taken against German or Italian Americans. This grandfather and his small grandchildren were just some of the many Japanese Americans forced out of their homes and incarcerated during the war. They were rounded up by soldiers, often at gunpoint, and transported to locations often unknown. Japanese Americans suffered some of the most severe violations of constitutional rights in our nation's history. But today's program does not focus on that incarceration. Today's story is instead about the legal resistance, redress, and repair of the Constitution. What happens when the President, Congress, the military, and even the Supreme Court all fail to protect the constitutional rights of an unpopular minority? That's not just a Japanese American question. It's a question for all Americans. It's a question for then, and it's a question for now. Most Japanese Americans during the war complied with the government orders. They hoped their obedience would demonstrate their loyalty to the U.S., and they hoped it would help prevent even harsher actions being taken against them. Others volunteered or were drafted into the military service while their families remained behind barbed wire, such as this family. They served in racially segregated combat units with extraordinary honor and valor, incurring some of the highest casualty rates of any military unit their size in American history. Still others chose another path. They chose to fight in the courts. They challenged curfews, exclusion orders, detention, and military conscription. These are 3 of the legal resistors we'll be discussing. Gordon Hirabayashi on your left, Minori Yasui, and Fred Korematsu. They asked whether the Constitution still applied in times of fear and war. They asked whether the Constitution still applied to them. I call these Americans the resistors because they challenged unjust and unconstitutional actions. They are some of my heroes. But their resistance was extremely unpopular at the time. Many people, even within the Japanese American community, regarded them as disloyal, as traitors to the U.S., for challenging the government's wartime actions against them. In their early challenges to the wartime actions, even the ACLU refused to represent them. They were ostracized and threatened. They were convicted and imprisoned. And yet history would ultimately vindicate their legal claims. Their efforts helped expose one of the gravest constitutional failures in American history. They contributed to the eventual repair of that constitutional damage. And their story is the story that I want to tell today. My presentation will be discussing 3 stages of resistance. The first was the legal protests that occurred during the wartime actions, which were defeated by the government's claims of military necessity. The second part, I'll focus on the post-war discoveries that show that the claim of military necessity was false and that wartime actions were instead based on race prejudice. And finally, I'll focus on the post-war efforts that secured redress and repair of these constitutional violations. So let's start by exploring the people who resisted during the war. Who were these people who challenged the government's actions? There were hundreds of Japanese Americans who protested during the wartime. I'll mention today only the most prominent ones, but all were courageous individuals who are due honor and thanks. The first category of resistors were criminal defendants who refused to comply with wartime orders for mass curfew, mass exclusion, and mass detention. They challenged the orders that deprived constitutional rights of the entire Japanese American population on the West Coast, every man, woman, and child, due solely to their race. These weren't famous people when they began their resistance. They were ordinary Americans who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances. Minori Yasui was one of the first Japanese American attorneys in Oregon. He believed citizens had a duty to challenge unjust laws. He wanted to test the constitutionality of the curfew order that was imposed against Japanese Americans. So one night he deliberately walked the streets after curfew. Then he spent hours trying to convince the police officers to arrest him. When they refused, he finally walked into a police station and demanded to be taken into custody. Gordon Hirabayashi was the son of Japanese immigrant farmers in Washington state. He was a deeply religious Quaker and believed every person possessed equal worth before God. When the government imposed race-based restrictions on Japanese Americans, Gordon could not remain silent. He violated the curfew orders and then he violated the exclusion orders and turned himself in for arrest. He said that if democracy means anything, it had to apply during wartime. So his decision to resist was an act of conscience. And then there was Fred Korematsu. He was a young shipyard worker in California who was in love with a Caucasian woman. When exclusion orders were issued to try to force him out of his home, he did not want to leave his home, his job, or the woman he hoped to marry. He altered his appearance, he changed his name, and he tried to remain behind. His resistance began as a very personal decision, but it ultimately made him one of the most important civil rights figures in American history. So what happened to these young men? Each one of them were convicted of violations of the wartime orders. The military necessity required exclusion and imprisonment of all Japanese Americans on the West Coast. The government said that mass actions based on race were needed because the Japanese Americans posed an imminent threat to our national security, and there was no time to separate the loyal from the disloyal persons. All 3 of these men appealed their criminal convictions to the U.S. Supreme Court, but the court deferred to the military's judgment of necessity and upheld their criminal convictions. So Gordon Hirabayashi, Minori Yasui, and Fred Korematsu became federal convicts sentenced to prison. The second category of wartime resistors were those who raised court challenges to the draft. Did you know that in 1943, the government began forcibly conscripting, that is, drafting, Japanese American men from the prison camps to serve in racially segregated combat units. That was while they and their families were still incarcerated and deprived of all of their constitutional freedoms. Over 300 detainees in these camps raised court challenges asking whether the government had a right to draft Japanese Americans while imprisoning them and denying constitutional rights for them and their families. Their slogan was "Free us before you draft us." Free us before you draft us. It seems like it would be a compelling argument. They said, we'll serve in combat if you honor our rights as US citizens, but not when you violate our rights and continue to hold us in prison camps. What happened to them? Their protests were denied. They were called traitors and disloyal. All were convicted and given harsh prison sentences. The third category of wartime resistors was a category of one admittedly loyal US citizen of Japanese ancestry. She was named Mitsui Endo. She was a 22-year-old clerical worker. She didn't violate any order. She complied with the government's orders to leave her home, and she went peacefully into the prison camps. But by July 1942, she was still in the prison camp, and she just wanted to go home. So she filed a petition demanding the government show a legal reason for her incarceration. Her petition threatened the entire mass internment program. So the government devised a strategy of giving Mitsui Endo a unique status by conceding that she was a loyal US citizen, she had committed no crime, and there was no military necessity for her continued confinement. In this way, the government hoped to avoid the court being able to rule on the mass imprisonment of the other 120,000 Japanese Americans. Indeed, the government told Miss Endo, you can leave the prison camp so long as you don't try to return home or you don't try to go to the West Coast. But she refused that condition. She wanted to go home. And she wanted a judicial determination of whether the US could imprison her and refuse her request to go home. So she stayed in the prison camp for 2 more years until her case was decided by the Supreme Court finally in December 1944. The Supreme Court ruled in that case that concededly loyal US citizens cannot be detained and ordered Mitsui Endo to be released and allowed to go home. But the government strategy had worked because the Supreme Court declined to rule on whether the imprisonment of all the other Japanese Americans was unconstitutional and whether there was any continuing military necessity for their imprisonment. To understand the failure of legal challenges posed by every one of the hundreds of criminal defendants, we need to understand a single phrase the government relied on to win the wartime cases. That phrase was military necessity, and it became the key to everything. What was its claim of military necessity that kept everyone imprisoned for 3 years? Legal claims of military necessity were based on a 1942 official report entitled The Final Report, Japanese Evacuation from the West Coast. It was authored by General John DeWitt, the commanding general of the Western Defense Command, which included all of the West Coast states. General DeWitt had been quoted in the press. General DeWitt had been quoted in the press. Let me get that one to stay. There we go. Making racist remarks about ethnic Japanese on the West Coast. But his final report, which was given to the Supreme Court, did not rely on those remarks. His report instead said there were disloyal members of the Japanese American community. They were endangering the West Coast. There was insufficient time for hearings to separate the loyal from the disloyal Japanese Americans, and military necessity required their immediate mass exclusion and imprisonment for national security. During oral argument in Fred Korematsu's case, A justice asked the Solicitor General, that's the attorney from the US government that represents the government in cases before the court. So a justice is asking the Solicitor General about whether there was any evidence contrary to the government's claim of military necessity. Well, the Solicitor General responded that the government was not retreating from its reliance on military necessity, and that, quote, no person in any responsible position has ever taken a contrary position. For decades, Americans assumed these wartime cases had been decided on an accurate record. But then discoveries were made by two remarkable archivists that changed everything. Oops. In 1983, a talented archivist named Aiko Herzig-Yoshinaga discovered evidence that General DeWitt's final report, that's the one we just looked at, had been revised before it was presented to the report. His original version of the report was more with some of the racial allegations that were more of his perspective, because he said that Japanese Americans were dangerous because of their race. But this racist rationale was problematic in defending the wartime cases. That was likely to be unsuccessful. So that original version and all drafts were ordered burned. This photo is a certificate that about the destruction and burning of all of those drafts and briefs, all of the original reports and the galley proofs and the drafts related to that original final report. So General DeWitt's final report was altered to say that the wartime actions weren't taken because of race. No, it's not because of race. It's because simply there was not enough time to determine who was loyal and who was not. That's Aiko Herzig-Yoshinaga, a brilliant archivist, and I don't think anybody else in this nation could have realized when she ran across a stray document that there had been an earlier final report that somehow had survived this certification of burning, and she could see what the original statements were in the original final report before it was burned. About the same time as Aiko's discovery, legal historian Peter Irons uncovered confidential internal Justice Department documents about the wartime cases. Those documents showed that the Department of Justice attorneys knew at the time of the wartime cases that there were willful historical inaccuracies and intentional falsehoods, I'm using their quotes, in General DeWitt's final report regarding his claims about Japanese Americans. And these attorneys further knew that withholding the truth about contrary views by intelligence agencies could be illegal suppression of evidence. Those contrary views included a report by Lieutenant Commander Kenneth Ringel, who was the Navy's most knowledgeable expert regarding Japanese Americans. This is a copy of his confidential report in January 1942, before any of the mass exclusion and detention actions had occurred. In this confidential report, he says Japanese Americans posed little or no threat to the nation. At most, there were a few disloyals, as in any group. Any disloyal people could be handled individually, as was already being done for the German Americans and Italian Americans. He further said that no mass action should be taken against Japanese Americans. There was no need, and that was not a wise course of conduct because it could actually engender problems to take mass racial actions like that. Well, the Supreme Court never heard those facts. Instead, as you may recall, the Solicitor General was asked about any contrary facts, and he responded that, quote, no responsible person has ever taken a contrary position, end quote, to the government's claim of military necessity. And yet that was false. The government knew they had contrary intelligence information in their possession at the time, such as this report from Lieutenant Commander Kenneth Ringel and from other agencies assigned intelligence duties. So the wartime cases had been decided without disclosure of critical confidential evidence that refuted General DeWitt's claims of military necessity. As a result, the court issued rulings upholding the government's claim of military necessity in each of the wartime cases. Well, the camps were finally closed in 1945 and 1946. The wartime cases were over, but the constitutional questions they had raised were not. Many Japanese Americans had been unjustly imprisoned for nearly 3 years. Their properties, livelihoods, and homes were lost, reputations were forever damaged, and their psychic damage was immense. Would America ever recognize those wrongs? A few years after the war, Congress did recognize that Japanese Americans had suffered damages different from most other Americans, so Congress passed the 1948 Evacuation Claims Act. It compensated Japanese Americans for very limited economic losses, but it provided no compensation for the constitutional injuries, for the lost income, or emotional harms caused by incarceration, or for many other types of damages. For the next 4 decades, survivors, activists, and community leaders would undertake remarkable campaigns for constitutional redress. They pursued many different strategies through Congress, the courts, and public opinion to try to avoid the situation you see in the picture of families being forced out of their homes and into prison. In waging these efforts for redress, they often faced insurmountable odds. While they had different philosophies, there were 3 common goals. Number 1, to recognize the constitutional violations that Japanese Americans had suffered. Number 2, to prevent similar actions from ever occurring again to any other unpopular minority. And number 3, to provide some measure of redress for the wrongs done to Japanese Americans. In 1976, on the occasion of the country's 200th birthday, President Ford issued a presidential proclamation terminating President Roosevelt's Executive Order 9066. That was the order that had authorized the mass detention and imprisonment. So it was finally terminated in 1976. The president said in part, "We now know what we should have known then. Not only was that evacuation wrong, but Japanese Americans were and are loyal Americans." That's one of my heroes, Patsy Mink, behind the President Ford in this photo, and Daniel Inouye on her right, one of Hawaii's senators. Sadly, this proclamation provided no redress. It did nothing to prevent future occurrences, and it did not disclose nor address what government officials had actually known at the time. In the 1970s and 1980s, civil rights victories were occurring for other minority groups, and some Japanese Americans requested Congress to provide redress for Japanese Americans. Representatives Norman Mineta and Robert Matsui, both of California, urged Congress to pass a bill to make a formal apology and provide compensation for Japanese Americans. But redress was not politically feasible when Japanese Americans constituted only about 2% of the US population, and many Americans didn't even know any Japanese Americans, and they didn't understand or know what they had experienced. So more years passed with no congressional redress approved. In 1980, a compromise was reached to create a congressional commission to study the wartime actions against the Japanese Americans. Advocates hoped that the study might make it easier to get redress later. So a Congressional Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians was formed in the 1980s, and it took formal testimony all over the United States in hearings such as this one. Approximately 750 Japanese Americans and government officials testified. Numerous governmental documents were declassified for the first time to show what had really happened. For many incarcerees, these hearings were the first time they had publicly spoken about what happened. Many had remained silent for nearly 40 years due to the deep shame they had internalized. For many in the general public, It was the first time they heard about what had really happened. The nation was finally listening. The commission completed its work with an exhaustive historical accounting and a comprehensive report entitled Personal Justice Denied. The commission's conclusion, after a thorough examination, was that the actions against Japanese Americans were not based on military necessity. Those actions were instead due to, quote, race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership, end quote. The commission recommended redress to be provided in two specific forms: $20,000 redress for each Japanese American who was still alive, who was subjected to wartime exclusion or the prison camps, and an education fund to assure that this never occurs again. The truth about military necessity was finally out after this exhaustive study. But by now, it was over 40 years after World War II. The camps had been closed for years. The wartime cases were done many years earlier. At this point, some people asked a very understandable question: why continue fighting for redress when the events occurred over 40 years ago? Ironically, the answer had been given in the 1944 Korematsu decision by Supreme Court Justice Robert Jackson, his photo here, in his dissenting opinion in that case. He wrote, once a judicial opinion approves a military order like Executive Order 9066, quote, the court for all time has validated the principle of racial discrimination in criminal procedure and of transplanting American citizens, end quote. And then he went on to issue a famous warning, quote, the principle then lies about like a loaded weapon, ready for the hand of any authority that can bring forward a plausible claim of an urgent need, end quote. One of the persons who took that warning to heart was William Horry. William was the son of a Methodist minister who'd spent part of his youth behind barbed wire in the prison camps. He believed Japanese Americans should have the same right as any other American to sue the government to seek justice. He organized the National Council for Japanese American Redress and brought the largest lawsuit ever filed on behalf of Japanese Americans. His lawsuit was filed in 1983 and had 24 other named plaintiffs with him, and was a class action lawsuit against the United States for the wartime injustices. They sought compensation for the entire class of 120,000 Japanese Americans, and they asked the courts to declare that the wartime actions had violated numerous important constitutional rights of the Japanese Americans. I was involved for 6 years in the work on this lawsuit that went up to the Supreme Court. When the case was heard by the courtroom was filled with persons who'd been imprisoned during the war, including Fred Korematsu, here in a picture with me with longer hair on the morning of our hearing. They were now freed from prison camps, and they wanted justice. Soon after the hearing began, Justice Thurgood Marshall asked the government's attorney, the Solicitor General, what is the difference between exclusion and killing? When you pick up people and throw them out of their homes and where they live, what is anything between that and murder? As the court's only African-American justice, Marshall immediately grasped the profound human consequences of exclusion and incarceration. My client nudged me and said, he gets it. And indeed he did. But the case was ultimately dismissed because of the statute of limitations. The court said that even if claims of misrepresentation and suppression of evidence and conspiracy for cover-up were true, Japanese Americans had waited too long to seek redress from the courts. Well, other types of lawsuits were also being pursued. They're called coram nobis petitions. Remember these gentlemen, Gordon Hirabayashi, Minori Yasui, and Fred Korematsu? They filed petitions to vacate or rescind criminal convictions that were imposed against them that had been obtained by error, including fraud on the court. So their coram nobis petitions were based on the newly discovered evidence of the government's cover-up. Now that the truthful record of the government's actions was finally put before the courts responded by vacating the criminal convictions of Fred Korematsu, Gordon Hirabayashi, and Minori Yasui. The court findings from those cases included, quote, there is substantial support in the record that the government deliberately omitted relevant information and provided misleading information in papers before the court. The information was critical to the court's determination. The judicial process is seriously impaired when the government's law enforcement officers violate their ethical duties to the court. End quote. These lawsuits inspired further efforts to obtain congressional redress. In 1988, the Civil Liberties Act was passed. And here, it's being signed by President Reagan. In the act, Congress formally adopted the commission's findings that the government's wartime actions were not justified by any military necessity and were instead due to race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. The Civil Liberties Act required payments of $20,000 to each surviving Japanese American who had been imprisoned or forced from their home during the war. About 82,000 persons were still surviving, who received payments totaling $1.6 billion. About 300 of those Japanese Americans were living in Hawaii, who had been forced out of their homes here. While this compensation did not fully recognize the degree of injury this community had suffered, it was clearly a symbolic victory and a recognition of wrongdoing. In 1990, a Department of Justice ceremony occurred to distribute the first checks, going to the eldest and oldest survivors first. I was honored to attend in the Hall of Justice, where survivors were ushered onto the stage in wheelchairs. The Attorney General was Richard Thornburgh. That's him on the right. In order to be able to look the Japanese Americans in the eyes, he went down on his knee so that he could look them in the eyes as he presented their checks, compensation, and apology. I don't think there was a dry eye in the room as we watched the symbolism of the nation's Attorney General on his knee with a formal apology and cash payments. Letters of apology signed by President Bush also went out to all survivors, saying in part, a monetary sum and words alone cannot restore lost years or erase painful memories. We can never fully right the wrongs of the past, but we can take a clear stand for justice and recognize that serious injustices were done to Japanese Americans during the war. End quote. A few years later, Congress made additional appropriations in apology to almost 800 Japanese Latin Americans. Did you know that our government had forcibly kidnapped ethnic Japanese persons from Latin America and incarcerated them in the US in our prison camps during the war to use as pawns for trade for American POWs that had been held abroad? So these Japanese were also provided compensation. In 1998, President Jimmy Carter awarded Fred Korematsu the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the nation's highest civilian honor, for his lifelong fight for justice and his courageous defiance of the World War II imprisonment of Japanese Americans. Years later, sadly after the other resistor heroes had died, Gordon Hirabayashi and Minori Yasui were also awarded Presidential Medals of Freedom, and Mitsui Endo was awarded the Presidential Citizens Medal for their exemplary deeds of service to the country in challenging the government's unjust wartime actions. But wait, there's more. The U.S. Solicitor General also made a formal admission of fault in the wartime cases, stating, quote, the Solicitor General's office knowingly failed to disclose critical evidence to the court and did not inform the court of the contrary conclusions of the Office of Naval Intelligence and Military Intelligence, end quote. So it seemed that the damage to the Constitution was finally being repaired and that Americans were finally recognizing the injustices that had occurred to the Japanese American community. But then came 9/11 and the terrorist bombings of the World Trade Center. Government officials began invoking the wartime Korematsu precedent to support proposed actions against Muslim and Arab Americans. Their arguments sounded familiar. Debates swirled around whether history would repeat itself and whether the Korematsu case precedent allowed the government to take actions against Muslim Americans. Over 60 years earlier, as you recall, Justice Jackson feared the Supreme Court's Korematsu decision would be like a loaded weapon for the government's future use against the next unpopular minority. That precedent remained alive. The loaded weapon was still sitting on the shelf. Civil rights groups brought lawsuits to try to protect Muslim and Arab Americans from immigration and travel bans. And a surprise occurred in one of the Supreme Court's cases on that subject matter, called Trump versus Hawaii in 2018. Chief Justice John Roberts wrote the court's decision in the case and stated, quote, "The forcible relocation of U.S. citizens to concentration camps solely and explicitly on the basis of race is objectively unlawful and outside the scope of presidential authority," end quote. He further held, quote, "Korematsu was gravely wrong the day it was decided, has been overruled in the court of history, and to be clear, has no place in law under the Constitution," end quote. Finally, the Supreme Court itself acknowledged both the decision and the rationale and precedent in its wartime Korematsu case was gravely wrong at the time and should never be used again. But the future of our Constitution is not secure and requires eternal vigilance from attack. Ironically, in the very same case in which Justice Roberts repudiated an overruled Korematsu case with those words, the court went on to uphold travel restrictions aimed primarily at persons from Muslim-majority countries. The government's injustices to the Japanese American community and the government's wartime misconduct, misrepresentation, and suppression of evidence in the wartime cases are not merely modern interpretations, nor are those findings mine. These findings are now the conclusion of Congress, the President, the Congressional Commission, the Quorum Nobis courts, the Solicitor General of the United States, and ultimately now the Supreme Court itself. Achieving justice for the Japanese Americans would never have occurred without the courage and persistence of those who challenged the injustices in courts and Congress. Those who challenged the government's actions ultimately won a measure of redress they so well deserved and helped repair a constitution that had failed them personally. In conclusion, as I reflect on this history, I see Japanese Americans confirming and confronting the government's ideals by challenging injustice in different ways. The veterans of the 100th Battalion and 442nd Regimental Combat Team defended America on the battlefields in Europe and helped save democracy abroad. The legal resistors helped ensure that our Constitution would endure, and in so doing, helped strengthen our democracy at home. Together, they remind us that that citizenship requires courage, vigilance, and actions to assure that our country can live up to its guarantees and ideals, and to assure that no future generations of Americans will be subjected to similar injustices. Because of all of these resistors, our country and Constitution became stronger. That is their legacy, worthy of remembrance, gratitude, and honor. Before I end my remarks, I wanted to share some resources in case you might want more details than I could provide in this short program. You've just seen the pictures of this, but Personal Justice Denied is a thorough treatment and governmental account of what happened in the wartime actions against Japanese Americans, including the evidence previously concealed by the government. Justice at War is Peter Arn's story of the Japanese American internment cases and his archival discoveries, as well as the Coram Nobis cases and the evidence of governmental misconduct that he was instrumental in discovering. Rachel Maddow did a 6-part podcast earlier this year for MSNOW, focusing on the governmental misconduct, misrepresentations, and suppression of evidence in the Korematsu case. She really brings it alive by personal interviews from decades ago that she's able to excerpt for purposes of that podcast. And Repairing America, an account of the movement for Japanese American redress by William Horry, that focuses on the variety of grassroots redress efforts and the class action to the Supreme Court. Let me thank you for your participation today. We have time for questions or comments, and I look forward to your thoughts.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Ellen. That was amazing what you shared with us, and so many different layers and the ways to think about what happened to Japanese Americans in our country during that time period. So many thought-provoking examples that you shared. I wrote down a lot of the quotes that resonated with me, such as "free us before you dropped us," "military necessity," "knowingly failed." Yeah, a lot of very, very striking examples that you shared with us today. Yeah, you're getting a lot of claps, as you can see as well. So I definitely see a question number one in the group chat, but I think behind the scenes for folks, you don't see is Weston Saito. He is our magician behind the scenes with Pacific Historic Parks, helping to ensure all this goes smoothly for all of us tonight. I know folks may have also been sharing some questions for you, Ellen, with him, but let me just go ahead and start with the one that's in the group chat. So from Gary Anderson, thank you, Ellen, for your dedication in writing this injustice to our Japanese American citizens. Please tell me what inspired you to fight the cause.
I grew up in the South of the United States and didn't even realize our city was segregated until I was a teenager. And seeing the racial injustices to me seems so cruel. And I decided I wanted to become a civil rights attorney. And I proceeded on a path toward being an attorney and doing civil rights work. And I found this job just 1 year out of law school and was thrilled to do something of this magnitude. It's been the greatest honor in my life.
That's wonderful, Ellen. So I think I have a question myself in terms of when you might have learned about Honolulu. So I was born and raised here, and I did not know this happened in Hawaii. And being Nisei myself, when I read about it, it really made the history very personal for me. And so there are distinctions between kind of what happened on the continent versus the Japanese Americans who experienced the racial prejudice during World War II here in Hawaii. One significant difference is it was under martial law here instead of Executive Order 9066. But same reasoning, military necessity to preserve our country. So I was curious, just given your experience, when do you remember when you learned about Honolulu, or that this had happened here as well?
I learned about it when I was representing the Japanese Americans in the class action lawsuit because my client, William Horry, was here in Hawaii and he wanted to see Honolulu. And I had not been there before. And I said, okay, we'll try to find it. And so we went out toward Eva and toward the area that seemed to be Honolulu. And we spent part of a day searching for Honolulu and we didn't come up with it, which I was very frustrated about. But we did find Sand Island out there and where the people had to build their own prison camp
Right.
around at Sand Island. But I only later learned through you so many of the details about Honolulu and by being able to take the personal tours of
Yeah.
Honolulu that has brought it alive. Thank you for what you're
Yeah.
doing.
No, thank you. So one of the questions is, and you're getting a lot of accolades in the group chat as well, but I think one of the questions that were sent behind the scenes was, if you don't mind sharing, Ellen, how old were you when you were in that photo? And
That's a good question.
were you nervous being before the Supreme Court or having your work before the Supreme Court?
I think I was about 20. Oh boy, that's a good question. 1987. Oh boy, 87, 32, I guess. Oh, so maybe early 30s. And yes, there was tremendous nervousness from day one representing this group of people. We knew the statutes of limitations were huge hurdles. We knew that something called sovereign immunity, the ability to actually sue the government, was a huge hurdle. And we searched and searched for loaded guns and smoking guns and anything else that could be able to help persuade the Supreme Court that this was a case worthy of hearing. So we were all very, very nervous about whether the court would have finally allow the hearing of the facts and allow the full case development, which sadly it did not by deciding that the statute of limitations barred the case.
Mm-hmm. So I'll go back to somebody who posed a question in the group chat. Can you talk a little more about the Latin Japanese who were kidnapped? This is the first time hearing about it.
Oh, you may want to read a book called Adios to Tears, because it deals with that subject matter. But our government at the time knew that there were American POWs and other people that it wanted to try to trade to get back into the US. And even though it already had 120,000 Japanese Americans locked up in the prison camps, for some reason they thought they needed more. And they went down to Latin America and several countries and kidnapped, really, brought them to the US under military officials and declared them to be undocumented illegal aliens here. They were never given their citizenship. And when the war, those who weren't traded off as pawns were deemed to be illegal residents here in the US when the war ended, which was extremely ironic since it's the government that had kidnapped them and brought them here against their will. Fascinating story worth reading about.
Yeah. So I'm going to go back to a question that was asked behind the scenes. I'd learned through some of the talks last year of the park that German Americans and Italian Americans were also put in prisons. Do you know anything about their if they were ever given reparations or acknowledged as well in the same way?
I do not believe that they were. The German Americans and Italian Americans were treated with individualized hearings and a judicial process of due process. Well, excuse me, some form of due process, not ideal, obviously. And there were some Japanese Americans in that situation too that got individualized hearings. But no, the congressional compensation for redress was only for those who were subjected to mass exclusion orders, mass imprisonment orders, or otherwise put into these prison camps.
Okay.
But not other types of camps.
Great. So go back to a group chat question. Rachel Maddow's burn order was an amazing story of Aiko Yoshinaga's discovery of the one original copy of the final report that you had shared. Can you speak a little bit more about this?
Oh, it's fascinating. Without Aiko and without Peter, we would not have had this evidence that the government knew good and well at the time that it had contrary military intelligence from the agencies that were assigned the responsibility for Japanese American intelligence. And they had said there was not a need for mass exclusion. There were not really illegal activities and espionage going on. But here's certain officials within the government claiming that Japanese Americans posed a risk when really there was not an evidentiary basis behind it. The discoveries were in remote areas of archive where one would not expect those documents to have existed. They weren't found in normal places where one would conduct a search. It's almost happenstance that they were found, except both of those archivists are extremely talented, were so diligent, and were spending so much time trying to unearth any iota of information that they could find. And they ran across them and were able to bring them to the attention of the courts.
Mm-hmm. So there's so I'll flip back to the person who asked a behind the scenes question. I think Wes has one of those.
Yeah, so Ellen, I have from Stacy, and then she asked, how can we ensure future generations are educated? And speaking to someone in their 20s who was schooled in Arizona, they had not heard anything about internment, the 100th or the 442nd.
Oh, it's sad, isn't it? And history can repeat itself when people don't recall the history. So that's part of what this program is all about, is helping educate the next generations. It's what Christine and the National Park Service are trying to do at Honouliuli. And it's why there's so much publication going on about this right now, because it's not just Japanese Americans. It's any unpopular religious faith, any unpopular racial minority, any unpopular national origin group that could be subjected to actions like this. And we all need to help spread the news. So that's what I'm doing many years after my involvement in the case and many years after retirement, is just trying to find ways to help educate and get people excited about learning more about this and spreading the news. So thank you to each of you that helps spread the news.
And we are so grateful for you to be part of that as well. So I think that's a great way to kind of conclude our hour. We just have a couple more minutes, and I want to be respectful of people's times. I know there's so many more questions and other comments that you're getting in the chat. So I hope you take a look at some of that as well. But a lot of accolades for the information that you shared. And I noticed that a couple of people also had personal stories about their experiences with some of what you shared as well. So I hope you have an opportunity to read a little bit about that. So with just a couple more minutes left for the evening, I do want to invite folks to continue to engage with all our 80th events this year. And I'm going to put the website up there that you can take a look at all the other events, and then also tee up if you enjoyed this speaker series. And that's exactly what we're doing. The theme of this year, as Ellen had just shared her thoughts with us on that last question, is that, you know, we did want to focus on remembrance this year because it's 80 years. And you know, we are getting farther away from this history. The next generation, you know, people in their 20s, as the person had asked, hadn't ever heard of this. And it's really important because history is not the past. We live and create history every day, and it continues to inform us in how we are as a nation, past, present, and going forward in the future. So with that, I just want to tee up the series of the speaker series this year is Remembrance. How do we keep this history alive in front of everybody to have great discussions like this about and learn? So we're reaching out to different people. Ellen was the representative kind of from the legal perspective, and now we're in July focusing on people who really promote and conserve this history and help us to remember it through our museum collections. So July 8th, we are having our 3 people representing 3 museums related to Japanese American incarceration, and they're going to talk about how they keep their collections alive and how they keep the history alive through their work that they do through curating these museum collections. The other speaker, actually, maybe Ellen, you might want to join for this one, is we're looking at how this history is kept alive and remembered through the art. The Delphine Hirasuma, she wrote the beautiful Art of Gaman book, which actually was a Smithsonian exhibit several decades ago. But she is going to share with us some of the beautiful artwork and the casts that were created in these Japanese American incarceration sites. So she's also going to be our speaker for the month of July. And we will continue this theme of remembrance through the different lens: architecture, technology. So please check that for some of our other speakers in the months of August and September as well. So with that, I just want to thank everybody for taking time out of their evenings, some of you on the West Coast, so it's very late for you, to join us tonight. This will be recorded. We'll try to get it up on our website. We try to do it within a week. So look back if you have friends who weren't able to make it and missed it, or just wanted to hear it again because there was so much great information. It was recorded, and we will have the link available on the park's website as well. So with that, thanks to Pacific Historic Parks and for hosting us and creating this wonderful speaker series, to Ellen for sharing so much of your knowledge with us and your experiences, and to all of you for taking the time. So have a good evening, everybody, and we hope to see you on our next speaker series. Good night.
Thank you.